The room laughed at the $1 bill, but the German shepherd stared at it like it was the only honest thing in the will. Samuel Brooks stood near the back of Margaret Ellis's law office with his hands folded in front of him, trying not to look as out of place as he felt. He was 40 years old, a white veteran with broad shoulders, a weathered face, dark brown hair cut short but no longer kept with military sharpness, and a few silver threads showing near his temples. He wore a faded field jacket over a blue work shirt, worn jeans, and scuffed brown boots still dusted from the gravel lot outside. Around the long conference table sat Harold Whitaker's relatives in dark coats, polished shoes, clean watches, and the quiet confidence of people who had arrived expecting things with weight: a house, a bank account, a piece of land, something framed by law and family name. Samuel had not come expecting anything. He had known Harold only as the old man from Briar Glen Road, the one he had helped on a freezing March night when a storm had knocked a maple limb across the driveway and the power had gone out. Samuel had cleared the branch, fixed a jammed generator switch, and stayed long enough to make sure Harold's little kitchen had heat again. He had refused payment because the old man's hands shook when he opened his wallet. That was all Samuel thought it had been: one cold night, one small kindness, forgotten by morning. Chief sat beside his chair, the 6-year-old German shepherd with a black and tan coat, strong chest, alert ears, and calm intelligent eyes. The dog had been allowed in because Margaret Ellis, who was stern enough to make objections die young, had simply said, "He stays." Now Chief watched the room without judgment, but when Margaret reached Samuel's name, the dog's ears lifted. Margaret was in her late 60s, silver hair pinned neatly, glasses low on her nose, voice steady from decades of reading the final wishes of people who could no longer explain themselves. She turned a page and said, "To Samuel Brooks, I leave the sealed envelope marked with his name, containing $1 and no further public distribution from this estate." Silence held for half a second. Then someone laughed. It was small at first, a sharp breath from a cousin in a navy suit. Then another relative covered her smile with 2 fingers. A man at the far end of the table leaned toward his wife and whispered loudly enough for the room to hear, "The cheapest charity in town." A few people chuckled. Samuel felt the old heat of embarrassment rise under his collar, but his face did not change. He had been judged in cleaner rooms by people who knew less about him. He had been thanked when useful and forgotten when inconvenient. He knew how to stand still while others decided what a man was worth. Margaret did not laugh. She slid the envelope across the table toward him. It was cream-colored, old-fashioned, sealed but not waxed, his name written in Harold's careful hand. Samuel accepted it with a quiet nod. "Thank you, ma'am." The navy suit cousin leaned back. "You drove all the way here for $1? Samuel looked at him, not angry, not wounded enough to give the man satisfaction. "No, sir," he said. "I came because someone asked me to." Chief rose then, slow and deliberate. He stepped closer to Samuel's leg and lowered his nose toward the envelope. He did not sniff randomly. He breathed in once, deep and focused, then looked toward the window facing Main Street. Margaret noticed. Her eyes moved from the dog to the envelope, then back to Samuel. But she said nothing. The reading continued. Houses went to nieces. Accounts went to nephews. A lake cabin went to a family trust. Voices became softer and more satisfied as property found its expected hands. Samuel stood through the rest because leaving early would have made the dollar look like an insult, and he would not let their laughter teach him bad manners. When it ended, the relatives gathered their folders and coats. Some passed him without looking. One man dropped a coin into the small tray near the door and gave Samuel a smile that was meant to be clever. Chief watched the coin fall, then ignored it completely. Outside, late afternoon light lay flat across the sidewalk. Samuel walked to his old pickup, opened the passenger door for Chief, and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. The envelope rested in his lap. For a while, he listened to the wind move dry leaves along the curb. Then he opened it. Inside was a crisp $1 bill folded once around something thinner than paper. Samuel carefully unfolded it. A small strip of onion skin paper slipped into his palm. The writing was faint but clear: if they laugh, let them. If you listen, come before dawn. Samuel's breath slowed. Chief leaned across the seat, nose almost touching the bill. On the back, near the corner, was a tiny blue ink mark shaped like a clock gear. Beneath the fold, written so small he almost missed it, was an address: Whitaker Clock Shop, 41 Main Street. Samuel looked up through the windshield. 3 blocks away, beyond the courthouse square, stood a narrow brick storefront with a cracked wooden sign and dusty windows, closed for as long as most townspeople could remember. Chief gave one soft breath and turned his head toward Main Street, ears high, eyes bright. The laughter from the office still lived somewhere behind Samuel, but it had grown distant now. In his hands, the smallest inheritance in the room had become a map. Samuel did not drive to the clock shop right away. He sat in the pickup with the $1 bill held flat between his fingers, watching the last of the daylight drain from Main Street and gather in the dusty windows of Whitaker Clock Shop. The storefront looked smaller than he expected, wedged between an empty shoe repair place and a used bookstore with sun-faded paperbacks in the window. Its wooden sign hung crooked, the gold letters nearly worn away, and behind the glass, shadowed shapes stood in rows like silent witnesses. Chief sat upright in the passenger seat, black and tan coat catching the dim orange glow from the street lamp, strong chest still, alert ears fixed toward the shop. The German shepherd had not relaxed since Samuel opened the envelope. Every few breaths, Chief looked from the bill to the storefront, as if the little blue gear mark carried a scent only he could follow. Samuel turned the bill over again. $1. Nothing more than a folded piece of paper to the relatives who had laughed. But Harold's message had changed its weight. If they laugh, let them. If you listen, come before dawn. Samuel looked at the sky. Dawn was hours away. Main Street was still awake in small-town ways, a pickup passing slow, the diner bell ringing as someone left, a woman locking the florist, the courthouse flag tapping softly against its pole. He could have waited until morning. He could have gone to the shelter lot outside town where he sometimes slept in the truck when money ran thin. But Chief suddenly gave a low, quiet breath and placed one paw against the dashboard. Not urgent. Not afraid. Certain. Samuel knew that tone better than words. All right, he said softly. We listen. He stepped out into the cool evening and clipped the leash to Chief's collar. The old key to Whitaker Clock Shop had not been in the envelope, but the front door had a mail slot, and through it Samuel could smell dust, old wood, brass polish, and the faint oily scent of tiny machines. He cupped his hands around his eyes and looked through the glass. Inside, clocks filled the narrow shop from floor to ceiling. Mantel clocks sat on shelves. Wall clocks hung crooked in rows. Cuckoo clocks rested with their little doors shut. Tall grandfather clocks stood along the back wall like old men in dark coats. Every face showed a different time, and none of them moved. Chief stood at the door, nose near the lower frame, ears forward. Then, from deep inside the shop, came a sound so faint Samuel almost mistook it for a memory. Tick. Silence. Tick. Not a clock running properly. One beat, separated by too much stillness, as if something inside the shop still had the strength to answer but not enough to speak loudly. Chief looked up at Samuel. Samuel looked down at the bill. The strip of onion skin paper had said before dawn, not necessarily at dawn. He walked to the alley beside the shop, where a narrow side door stood under a rusted awning. There was a small brass plate beside the knob, tarnished but readable beneath the grime. Deliveries. Samuel checked the frame. Old. Swollen from weather. The lock was simple, but he did not force it. Instead, he ran his fingers along the top of the doorframe, then under the loose brick beside it. His hand closed around a small magnetic key box. Inside was a brass key wrapped in a paper label that read, "For the one who checks the ordinary places first." Samuel let out a slow breath. Harold had known something about men who fix things. They always checked the ordinary places before assuming the impossible. The key turned with a soft scrape, and the side door opened into darkness. Chief entered first. Samuel followed, flashlight in hand, closing the door gently behind them. The shop was colder inside than the street. Dust lay across every counter. The air smelled of walnut cases, clock oil, metal gears, cardboard boxes, and time itself, if time had a scent after being left alone for years. Samuel's flashlight moved across hundreds of frozen faces. 10:12. 4:37. Midnight. 6:15. Each clock held a different abandoned moment. The sound came again from the back. Tick. Silence. Tick. Chief walked straight down the narrow aisle, past glass display cases filled with watch parts and tiny screwdrivers, past a wall of pendulums hanging still as reeds with no wind. Samuel followed slowly, his scuffed brown boots careful on the old floorboards. At the rear of the shop stood the largest grandfather clock, taller than Samuel, its dark cherrywood case carved with vines and small brass stars. The glass over its face was cloudy, but the hands were set exactly at 4:30. Chief stopped before it and sat. His ears were high, his calm, intelligent eyes fixed on the clock face. Samuel shined the light over the dial. There, just below the 12, was the same blue gear mark from the dollar bill. He opened the clock door. The pendulum inside was still, but from somewhere behind the face came the single impossible tick. Samuel took out the $1 bill. His hands were steady, but his chest had tightened. Behind the lower glass, where a keyhole should have been, was a narrow horizontal slot, barely wider than the bill itself. He hesitated only once. Then he slid the dollar into the slot. For a moment nothing happened. The shop remained cold. The clocks remained silent. Then the grandfather clock gave one soft click, and every frozen clock in the room answered with a single tick at the exact same time. For one suspended second, Samuel thought the whole shop had taken a breath. The sound was not loud, not frightening, not even dramatic in the way a person might expect from a room filled with frozen clocks suddenly answering together. It was small and clean, a single tick released from every wooden case, every brass wheel, every dusty face, like a chorus of old hearts remembering they had once kept time. Then silence returned, deeper than before. Samuel stood before the grandfather clock with the empty slot below its face, his flashlight trembling only slightly in his hand, the $1 bill now hidden somewhere inside the mechanism. Chief remained seated beside him, black and tan coat still under the pale beam, strong chest steady, alert ears lifted, calm intelligent eyes fixed on the lower cabinet as if the dog knew the clock had not finished. Samuel listened. The shop smelled of walnut, old oil, paper, and dust warmed by his own breath. Outside, Main Street had grown quiet, the diner lights dimming beyond the glass, the courthouse clock striking the hour somewhere down the block. Inside Whitaker Clock's shop, every clock stayed still, yet the room no longer felt abandoned. It felt awake and careful. Samuel crouched and examined the lower part of the grandfather clock. A scene showed where none had been visible before, a thin line beneath the pendulum cabinet. He pressed gently. Nothing. Chief leaned forward and touched the edge of the wood with his nose, then lifted one paw and tapped 3 times near the carved brass star at the base. Samuel slid his thumb along that spot and felt a hidden latch give way. A small drawer opened with a soft wooden sigh. Inside lay a brass key, an old leather ledger, and a photograph wrapped in tissue paper. Samuel lifted the photograph first. It showed Harold Whitaker much younger, standing in front of the clock shop with his sleeves rolled up and a smile almost too shy for the camera. Beside him stood 4 men in work clothes, older than Samuel had expected, each holding a repaired clock or a tool. One man wore a faded military jacket, and Harold had written on the back in blue ink, "The first men who taught me that time can be repaired when someone refuses to throw the clock away." Samuel read the line twice. It struck him gently, then deeply. Harold had not been only a wealthy old man in a quiet house. He had been someone who remembered being helped. Samuel opened the ledger. The first pages listed repairs from the 1970s, mantel clock spring, railway watch balance staff, courthouse regulator cleaning, church bell timer adjustment. Then the entries changed. Names appeared beside dollar amounts that were not repair bills. Rent paid for W. Harris. Tools purchased for D. Miller. Winter coats for 2 brothers leaving the veterans' home. Workshop wages advanced, no repayment requested. Samuel turned pages slowly. Harold had used the clock shop as more than a business. It had been a quiet place of repair for people, not just machines. Chief rose and moved toward the back wall, where dozens of clocks hung shoulder to shoulder. He stopped before a narrow section between 2 tall regulator clocks and stared. Samuel slid the ledger under one arm, took the brass key, and followed. Behind the clocks, the wall looked ordinary: dark wood paneling, dust, a few scratches near the base. Chief pressed his nose to one clock case, then to the next, then sat facing the center panel. Samuel ran his hand over the wood. There was no knob, no visible keyhole, no latch. He almost stepped back when he noticed the clock hands around him. Every clock on that wall, though still unmoving, had hands set to different times except for 3. One read 4:30. Another read 1:15. A third read 7:45. Samuel remembered the $1 bill. The address. The gear mark. The note. Harold was not testing luck. He was testing attention. He adjusted the first clock to 4:30, though it had already been close. He turned the second to 1:15. The third to 7:45. When the last hand settled into place, a small brass plate slid open at the center of the panel, revealing a keyhole. Chief gave one soft breath. Samuel inserted the brass key. It turned smoothly, too smoothly for something untouched by years. The wall released with a click, and the panel opened inward just enough for cold air to slip across Samuel's face. Behind it was a narrow passage lit only by his flashlight, with shelves on one side and a brick wall on the other. The passage led to a small workshop hidden behind the shop, dry, orderly, and untouched by the dust outside. Samuel stepped in carefully. Chief entered first, as always, his paws silent on the wooden floor. The hidden room held workbenches, watchmaker lamps, tiny drawers labeled in Harold's handwriting, cabinets of tools, framed patent drawings, sealed document boxes, and a safe beneath the far bench. On the center table sat another envelope, this one addressed simply, "For the man who did not laugh." Samuel stood very still. The words brought back the conference room, the polished shoes, the smirks, the man who had called Harold's gift the cheapest charity in town. He had not stayed dignified because he expected reward. He had stayed dignified because some part of him refused to let other people's smallness decide the shape of his soul. He opened the envelope. Harold's handwriting waited inside, steady and intimate. "Samuel, if you found this room, then you kept the $1, read the message, followed the mark, listened to the dog, and respected a gift everyone else dismissed. That means you noticed what mattered. Tomorrow morning, call Margaret Ellis before sunrise. Tell her the clock answered. Bring the ledger, the brass key, and the $1 if the clock returns it. Do not open the safe without her. The safe is not the fortune. It is the proof." Samuel lowered the letter as the hidden room seemed to expand around him. Chief had already walked to the safe under the workbench. The German shepherd placed one paw on the metal door, not scratching, not pushing, only resting it there with calm certainty. Samuel looked back toward the front shop, where the grandfather clock stood waiting in the dark. A faint mechanical sound came from within it, soft as a sigh. The $1 bill slid out of the slot and fell into the lower tray, untouched, unspent, and suddenly worth more than everyone in that room had imagined. Samuel did not sleep that night. He sat in the hidden workshop behind Whitaker Clock Shop with Chief lying at his feet, the brass key, the leather ledger, Harold's letter, and the $1 bill arranged on the workbench beneath a small watchmaker lamp he had managed to power from an old outlet near the floor. Outside, Main Street had gone still. The diner lights were dark, the courthouse windows were black, and the first pale edge of dawn had not yet touched the roofs. Inside the workshop, time seemed to gather rather than pass. Tiny drawers lined the walls, each labeled in Harold's neat handwriting: balance staffs, mainsprings, brass screws, jewel bearings, regulator pins. The room smelled of clock oil, old paper, walnut dust, and the faint metallic sweetness of tools kept clean by a man who respected small things. Samuel turned the $1 bill over in his hands again and again. It looked ordinary now, just a little creased where it had entered the grandfather clock, the blue gear mark still visible near the corner. Yet it had opened a mechanism, revealed a key, returned to him when its work was done, and made a roomful of laughter sound foolish without Samuel ever saying a word. Chief stirred, black and tan coat rising and falling with steady breath, strong chest resting against the wooden floor, alert ears moving each time a clock settled somewhere in the shop beyond the wall. The German shepherd seemed calm, but not finished. His eyes kept drifting toward the safe beneath the far bench, the one Harold had warned Samuel not to open without Margaret Ellis. The safe was small, black, heavy, and plain, with a brass dial and a narrow slot above the handle shaped exactly like the one in the grandfather clock. On its door, engraved in careful letters, were the words, "For the man who did not laugh." Samuel checked the time on his phone. 5:32 in the morning. Harold's letter said to call Margaret before sunrise. He stood, rolled his shoulders beneath the faded field jacket, smoothed the front of his blue work shirt, and dialed the number on the card Margaret had given him after the will reading. She answered on the second ring, her voice alert, as if she too had been waiting for the night to end. "Mr. Brooks." Samuel looked at the safe, then at Chief. "The clock answered," he said. For a moment there was only quiet on the line. Then Margaret exhaled, slow and soft. "Stay where you are. Touch nothing else. I will be there in 15 minutes. She arrived in 12, wearing a gray coat over a dark dress, silver hair pinned neatly, glasses already in hand, carrying a leather case and the solemn expression of someone approaching a promise kept long past the death of the man who made it. Samuel let her in through the side door. Chief greeted her with a calm lift of his head, then returned to the workshop as if leading both humans back to the truth. Margaret stopped when she entered the hidden room. Her eyes moved over the benches, the labeled drawers, the document boxes, the safe, and finally the old photograph on the table. "Harold told me this room existed," she said quietly. "But he never allowed me to see it. He said the room belonged to the person who earned the key by paying attention." Samuel handed her the ledger and Harold's letter. She read both under the lamp. As she read, the first gray light of morning slipped through a high narrow window and touched the dust in the air until the workshop looked almost underwater. "The public will was only the first layer," Margaret said at last. "The $1 was a legal token. Harold registered its serial number in a private trust document years ago. Whoever received it, kept it, followed the mark, and found this room would trigger the next clause." Samuel looked down at the bill. "And if I had thrown it away? Then the hidden trust would have passed to a charitable foundation after 30 days. Margaret's voice carried no judgment, only fact. "Harold believed wealth should never go to someone who could not respect small things." Chief stood and walked to the safe. He placed one paw gently below the engraved words. Margaret looked at him, then almost smiled. "He seems to understand procedure." Samuel gave the smallest breath of a laugh, the first sound near joy that had left him in a long time. Margaret opened her leather case and removed a sealed document, a notary stamp, and a small recorder for formal witnessing. "You must insert the $1 bill into the slot before the combination will engage. Harold was very specific." Samuel stepped to the safe. His hands were steady now, steadier than he expected. He slid the bill into the narrow slot. The safe clicked once. Margaret read a combination from her sealed document, and Samuel turned the dial slowly, left, right, left, each number landing with a soft mechanical certainty. When the final number aligned, the handle released. The door opened with a low metal sigh. Inside was no pile of cash, no glittering display, no theatrical treasure. There were folders, ledgers, stock certificates, property deeds, patent agreements, sealed bank documents, and a wooden box containing dozens of old letters tied with blue string. On top lay one final envelope addressed to Samuel. Margaret lifted the first folder, scanned the title, and her professional calm faltered. Ashwood Trust, she whispered. She opened another, then another. Her eyes widened behind her glasses. Harold did not exaggerate. Samuel felt Chief lean against his leg, warm and solid. What is it? Margaret sat slowly on the workshop stool, papers in hand, morning light brightening around her. Mr. Brooks, Harold Whitaker built a private estate through clock mechanism patents, commercial property on Main Street, manufacturing shares, and land holdings he never sold. Conservatively, this trust is worth around $50 million. The words did not enter Samuel all at once. They seemed too large for the little workshop, too large for a man who had counted gas money in quarters and slept in his pickup when work ran thin. He looked at the $1 bill, now resting in the safe slot, and thought of the relatives laughing under polished lights. Margaret continued, softer now. But there are conditions. Harold did not leave this to make you rich in the ordinary sense. He left instructions. Samuel opened the envelope with his name. Harold's handwriting waited, steady as a clock hand. Samuel, if Margaret is reading the trust aloud, then you have done what I hoped. You kept your dignity when others laughed. You listened when the world told you there was nothing to hear. I was once a poor young man with a broken shop and no place to sleep. A veteran gave me work, tools, and time. Everything I built afterward came from that mercy. If this trust reaches you, use it to keep time for others who have been told they are too late. Samuel lowered the letter as dawn finally reached the front windows of Whitaker Clock Shop. Somewhere in the showroom, one clock began to tick again, only one, soft and uneven, but alive. Samuel remained in the hidden workshop as the first living clock in the showroom found its uneven rhythm. Tick. Pause. Tick. The sound traveled through the wall with a fragile courage, as if one old mechanism had decided to begin again before the others were ready. Morning light widened across Whitaker Clock Shop, touching glass cases, brass tools, labeled drawers, and the safe that had just changed Samuel's life without making the room feel any larger. Margaret Ellis sat at the workbench with the Ashwood Trust folders spread in careful rows, her silver hair catching the lamp glow, her legal calm slowly returning as she sorted wonder into procedure. Chief lay beside Samuel's boots, black and tan coat warm against the floorboards, strong chest steady, alert ears lifting each time the ticking clock answered the silence. Samuel held Harold's final letter in both hands. $50 million. The number should have filled his mind, should have rushed through him with images of houses, vehicles, bank accounts, comfort, escape. Instead, all he could think about was Harold as a young man with a broken shop and no place to sleep, and an unnamed veteran who had given him work, tools, and time. Everything in the hidden room suddenly looked less like wealth and more like gratitude that had learned how to wait. Margaret opened the wooden box of letters tied with blue string. These may explain the purpose clause, she said. She untied the first bundle and read the top note silently before passing it to Samuel. The paper was old, thin, and soft at the folds. Dear Mr. Whitaker, thank you for letting my brother work in the shop until he found his footing. He came home believing no one would trust his hands again. You did. Samuel swallowed and read another. Thank you for teaching me to repair watches. I thought being late in life meant I had missed everything. You said clocks are only late if nobody winds them. Letter after letter carried the same quiet witness. Men who had found work behind the shop, women who had trained on tiny gears when no one else would hire them, veterans who had slept in the back room for a week or a month until they could stand steady again, families whose rent had been paid from accounts Harold never mentioned. The clock shop had not merely sold timepieces. It had returned time to people who thought theirs had run out. Chief stood suddenly and walked to the showroom door, nose lifted, ears forward. Samuel looked up. Voices sounded outside on Main Street. The town was waking. A delivery truck passed. Someone at the bookstore next door rattled a key in the lock. Margaret followed Chief's gaze toward the front windows. We should secure the shop before Harold's relatives hear rumors, she said. The public will was read yesterday. By noon, some of them will wonder why you stayed in town. Samuel looked at the safe, the trust folders, the letters, and the $1 bill now resting in a clear evidence sleeve Margaret had placed beside the ledger. They laughed because they thought it ended there. Margaret's expression softened. Harold suspected they would. He was not cruel, Samuel. He left them what the law and family obligation required. But he did not trust them with his promise. Why trust me? Samuel asked. The question came out quieter than he intended. Margaret removed one final envelope from the safe, this one labeled Background Notes. Inside were photographs, receipts, and handwritten observations. Samuel saw himself in one of the photos, taken from across a snowy street years earlier, kneeling beside Harold's old generator during that March storm. Another page described what Harold had seen. Samuel refused payment, checked the kitchen heat twice, gave the old man his own spare flashlight, salted the steps before leaving. Samuel lowered the page, embarrassed by the tenderness of being noticed. He had not known anyone was watching. Margaret said. Harold believed character shows most clearly when there is no audience. The words made the workshop feel warmer than the lamp could explain. Chief returned to Samuel's side and leaned against his leg. Outside, a car stopped near the curb. Through the dusty showroom window, Samuel saw the Navy suit cousin from the Will Reading step onto the sidewalk with two other relatives. They peered at the closed shop, then at Samuel's pickup. One of them laughed, but this time the sound did not enter him the same way. Margaret gathered the documents and stood. Do not engage them about the trust yet. I will file the activation notice this morning, then request formal certification of the Ashwood Trust. Until then, this room remains private. Samuel nodded. The relatives tried the front door, found it locked, and looked annoyed. Chief stood in the shadow of the showroom, calm, intelligent eyes watching without alarm. Samuel walked to the front counter but did not open the door. The cousin cupped his hands to the glass. Brooks? You in there? Come to spend your $1? The words hung in the morning air, thin and cheap. Samuel looked at the one restored clock on the wall. Tick. Pause. Tick. He thought of Harold's message, of the veteran who had once helped Harold, of all the people whose letters slept in the hidden room. Then he looked through the glass at the man who still thought the smallest gift was a joke. Samuel did not answer. He simply turned the little sign in the window from closed to by appointment, then stepped back into the quiet. Margaret smiled for the first time that morning. That was well said. Samuel almost smiled too. Behind him, another clock gave a soft click, then another. In the old shop, time was beginning to return one honest second at a time. By mid-morning, Margaret had turned Whitaker Clock Shop into a quiet legal command post, though nothing about the room looked powerful to anyone who did not know what waited behind the wall. The front showroom still held dusty glass cases, silent clocks, a cracked wooden counter, and a narrow beam of sunlight resting across the floorboards. But in the hidden workshop, folders from the Ashwood Trust lay arranged in careful stacks. The $1 bill rested in its clear sleeve beside Harold's ledger, and the safe stood open like a confession that had finally found the right witness. Samuel Brooks sat at the workbench with Chief beside his boots, the 40-year-old white veteran in his faded field jacket over a blue work shirt, worn jeans, and scuffed brown boots, broad shoulders still, weathered face calm, dark brown hair cut short with a few silver threads near his temples. He watched Margaret make phone calls in the steady voice of a woman who understood that truth needed paperwork if it wanted to survive greedy hands. She called the county clerk, Harold's trust accountant, a probate judge's assistant, and an appraiser who specialized in antique mechanical collections. Each call made the morning feel more real. $50 million was no longer a sentence floating in the air. It was becoming ink, appointment times, certification numbers, and people saying yes, Mrs. Ellis, we will review that immediately. Chief lifted his head every time someone tried the front door. The relatives came twice. First the Navy suit cousin, then a woman in a cream coat with dark sunglasses, then another man Samuel remembered from the will reading, the one who had smiled at the $1 as if kindness were a party trick. They knocked, peered through the glass, and called his name. Samuel did not open the door. Margaret had placed a printed notice in the window, "Estate review in progress. Entry by legal appointment only." The navy suit cousin read it, frowned, and took a picture with his phone. "That will start the clock," Margaret said from behind the workbench. Samuel looked at her. "What clock?" She almost smiled at the accidental poetry of it. "Their curiosity. By tonight they will know Harold left something more complicated than they understood. By tomorrow they will want explanations. We will give them only what the law requires." Samuel nodded, but his eyes went to the letters tied with blue string. The legal fight mattered, but it was not the part holding his attention. The part holding him was quieter: the people Harold had helped, the tools he had given, the rent he had paid, the time he had restored to those who thought their lives had already run late. Chief stood and walked to a cabinet beneath the watchmaker drawers. He nosed it once, then looked back. Samuel opened it, and found a wooden tray of small brass nameplates, each engraved with a name and a year. W. Harris, 1981. D. Miller, 1984. And Colby, 1992. Ray Jensen, 1999. More names filled the tray, dozens of them. Margaret came closer, reading over his shoulder. "Apprentices," she said softly. Samuel picked up one nameplate and rubbed dust from the letters. He kept them. Harold kept everything that proved people had mattered. The words settled into Samuel with the gentle force of a church bell heard from far away. Around noon, the trust accountant arrived, a careful man named Peter Leland with a brown briefcase and a face that had learned not to show surprise around money. He entered through the side door after Margaret verified him twice. In the hidden workshop, he reviewed the safe documents, the trust packet, the stock certificates, the patent agreements, the property deeds, and Harold's final instructions. The more he read, the quieter he became. At last he closed the top folder and looked at Samuel. "Mrs. Ellis is correct. The trust is active once the token condition is verified. The valuation is preliminary but credible. The assets are diversified, and the liquidity provisions are unusually thoughtful." Samuel stared at him. "Meaning?" Peter softened his voice. "Meaning Harold made sure the money could actually be used for the purpose he named." Margaret opened a final folder marked Purpose Clause. She read aloud, not dramatically, but clearly, "The Ashwood Trust shall support the restoration and operation of Whitaker Clock Shop as a vocational workshop, transitional employment center, and dignity fund for veterans, displaced workers, and others who demonstrate patience, humility, and willingness to learn a useful trade. The original $1 shall remain displayed on site as the initiating token and shall never be spent." Samuel looked at the dollar and its sleeve. The relatives had seen pity. Harold had written a doorway. Chief leaned against his leg, warm and steady, as another clock in the showroom clicked awake beyond the wall. Tick. Tick. Uneven, but trying. By late afternoon, Margaret filed the activation notice. Peter sealed copies for the court. The appraiser scheduled a visit for the next morning. The relative's attorney called twice and was told the same thing both times: formal notice would be provided when appropriate. Through it all, Samuel moved quietly through the shop, opening curtains, wiping dust from glass, checking outlets, making a list of repairs as if the building had given him orders he understood better than wealth. He replaced a burned-out bulb above the front counter. He swept the aisle between the clocks. He set Harold's photograph on the workbench. When he reached the grandfather clock, the one that had accepted and returned the dollar, he stood before it for a long moment. Chief sat beside him, ears relaxed now, eyes calm. "He trusted me with all this," Samuel said. Margaret, standing behind him, answered softly, "No. He trusted what you would do with it." Samuel looked around the shop, at the clocks beginning one by one to stir, at the hidden workshop full of names, at the street outside where people passed without knowing time had shifted inside the old brick storefront. He had entered the room yesterday as a man publicly handed $1. Now he stood inside a promise worth $50 million, and the richest part of it was not the number. It was the chance to prove that small things, kept with honor, could still open the largest doors. By the next morning, Whitaker Clock's shop had become the most watched quiet place on Main Street. People slowed as they passed the dusty windows, pretending to look at the old displays while trying to see past the reflection of the courthouse and the diner sign across the street. Samuel Brooks arrived before 7 with Chief at his side, the 40-year-old white veteran wearing his faded field jacket over a blue work shirt, worn jeans, and scuffed brown boots, his broad shoulders carrying a cardboard box of cleaning supplies, a notebook, and a responsibility too large to name casually. Chief walked in first through the side door, black and tan coat brushed clean, strong chest steady, alert ears forward, calm intelligent eyes moving from the front counter to the wall of clocks as if checking which old hearts had kept beating overnight. 4 clocks were running now. Not perfectly. Not together. One ticked too fast, one paused too long, one gave a soft wooden knock at the half hour, and the grandfather clock in the back answered them all with a deep, patient tone that seemed to come from below the floor. Margaret Ellis arrived with Peter Leland and an appraiser named Thomas Keene, a thin man in a tweed coat who carried cotton gloves, a magnifying glass, and the reverence of a person who understood that small mechanisms could hold large histories. They spent the morning in the hidden workshop cataloging Harold's collection. Rare pocket watches, prototype escapements, patent models, hand-cut gears, original drawings from a clock mechanism that had once changed factory timing systems across the country. Thomas worked quietly at first, then more slowly, as if the value of what he was seeing required him to breathe differently. "This is not just a shop collection," he said at last. "This is a mechanical archive." Samuel stood near the workbench with Chief beside his leg. The words should have thrilled him, but what caught his eye was still the tray of brass nameplates, the apprentices Harold had kept record of across decades. Peter reviewed updated trust summaries while Margaret prepared formal notices for Harold's relatives. By noon, the truth could no longer remain completely hidden. The Ashwood Trust was active. Samuel was the named steward. The $1 token had been verified. The value was real. The purpose clause was binding. When the relatives returned with their attorney, Margaret did not meet them in the hidden workshop. She met them in the front showroom beneath the clocks, where sunlight fell across dusty glass and the little sign still read by appointment. Samuel stood behind the counter, not because he owned the room in a proud way, but because Harold had asked him to stand there and keep time for something better. Chief sat beside the counter, calm, alert, and immovable. The navy suit cousin looked from Samuel to Margaret to the clocks beginning to tick on the wall. His confidence faltered before his voice did. "We were not informed there was a private trust." Margaret handed their attorney the formal notice. "You are being informed now." The woman in the cream coat stared at Samuel. "He got $50 million because he did not throw away $1? Samuel did not answer. Margaret did. "He triggered a trust condition because he honored a specific bequest, followed lawful instructions, and preserved the initiating token." The trust was Harold's property to structure. The attorney read in silence. The relatives whispered, their faces changing as each line did its work. There was no shouting, no dramatic collapse, only the slow discomfort of people realizing they had laughed at the door because they mistook it for a coin. Chief turned his head toward the grandfather clock. It struck once, low and warm. The sound moved through the room like a judge who needed no robe. After they left, Samuel expected relief, but what came instead was work. Margaret laid out the next steps: certification, insurance, building inspection, archival storage, trust governance, workshop licensing, and a public statement before rumor could turn mercy into spectacle. Peter explained funding streams and cautioned Samuel not to make promises faster than systems could support them. Thomas recommended preservation cases, climate control, and an expert horology team. Samuel listened to all of it, writing in his notebook with the careful attention of a man who had once been handed orders and now was being handed stewardship. In the afternoon, they opened Harold's final planning drawer. Inside was not another legal secret, but a sketch of the shop restored, front showroom polished but simple, hidden workshop converted into training benches, back room expanded into a small classroom, upstairs rooms repaired for temporary lodging, and a sign over the interior door reading second-hand works. Beneath the sketch Harold had written, "Teach what can be repaired. Employ those who need a patient start. Let the clocks remind them that time is not over." Samuel touched the paper lightly. Chief leaned against his leg. That evening, after the others left, Samuel stayed to clean the front window. He worked slowly, cloth moving in circles over years of dust until Main Street appeared more clearly through the glass. A boy stopped outside with his mother and pointed at the clocks. An older man paused, removed his cap, and looked at the Whitaker sign with recognition. The town was beginning to see the shop again. Samuel placed the $1 bill in a temporary frame behind the counter, not yet for display, just to keep it safe where he could see it. He looked at it for a long time. Yesterday it had been a joke in a conference room. Today it had survived lawyers, relatives, appraisers, and disbelief. But Harold had been right. The safe was not the fortune. It was the proof. The fortune was what could happen next if Samuel did not let money move faster than kindness. Chief settled near the grandfather clock, his ears relaxed, his eyes half closed as more clocks found their rhythm in the warming shop. Tick by tick, the room filled with uneven life. Samuel turned off the front lamp, leaving one small light glowing over the workbench. He had been given $50 million, but the first thing he truly owned was not wealth. It was the chance to make a place where people who had been laughed at could learn to hear themselves ticking again. By the third week, Whitaker Clock Shop no longer looked abandoned from the street. The front window had been cleaned until the courthouse, the diner sign, and the morning sky reflected clearly in the glass. The crooked wooden sign above the door had been rehung, the brass letters polished by hand, and a small paper notice beside the entrance read, "Second-hand works, restoration training beginning soon." Samuel Brooks still arrived before the town fully woke, a 40-year-old white veteran with broad shoulders, a weathered face, dark brown hair cut short but no longer kept with military sharpness, and a few silver threads near his temples, wearing his faded field jacket over a blue work shirt, worn jeans, and scuffed brown boots. Chief came with him every morning, the 6-year-old German shepherd with a black and tan coat, strong chest, alert ears, and calm intelligent eyes, walking through the side door first and pausing near the grandfather clock as if greeting the old mechanism that had opened the way. Margaret Ellis had formed the advisory board with Peter Leland, Thomas Keene, a retired vocational instructor, and a veterans outreach coordinator from the county. They moved carefully, not slowly, because Harold's money needed to become structure before it became promise. The hidden workshop was catalogued and protected. The most valuable clocks were placed in climate-controlled cases. The patent models were photographed. The apprentice nameplates were cleaned and mounted on a dark walnut board near the back room. The $1 bill was framed in museum glass above the front counter, with Harold's instruction beneath it in simple lettering: "The smallest gift can open the largest door." People came by to look at it. Some stood quietly. Some smiled with embarrassment because they had heard the story of the will reading and knew which side of the laughter they might have stood on. Samuel never corrected them. The shop itself did the correcting. On the first training morning, 8 people arrived. 3 were veterans between jobs. 2 were young men aging out of a group home. 1 was a single mother who had rebuilt small appliances for neighbors but had never been hired for technical work. 1 was a former factory worker with a hand tremor that eased when he focused on delicate parts. 1 was a quiet man who had lost his job when the hardware store closed and had been too proud to ask for help until Margaret called it paid training instead of assistance. Samuel stood before them in the back room beside a long bench covered with tools, tweezers, screwdrivers, loop glasses, oil cups, springs, gears, small clamps, and old clock faces waiting to be understood. Chief lay near the doorway, calm and attentive, his eyes moving from person to person without hurry. Samuel did not begin with a speech about money. He lifted a broken pocket watch from a tray and held it in his palm. Most people shake this, hear nothing, and call it dead, he said. But a good repair starts before you touch a tool. You look closely. You listen. You respect the thing enough to learn why it stopped. The room went very quiet. A young man in the front lowered his eyes. The single mother folded her hands around a pencil. Samuel set the watch down gently. That rule works on clocks. It works on people too. The first lesson was not difficult. Parts identification. Safe handling. How to open a case without scarring it. How to place each screw in order. How to write down what was removed before trying to fix what was wrong. Harold's old methods became classroom rules, and Samuel found he could teach them because he had lived them. Attention. Patience. No shame in starting small. Chief rose halfway through the morning and walked to the former factory worker, who was struggling to hold a tiny screw steady. The man froze, embarrassed by his trembling hand. Chief simply sat beside him, warm and still. The man breathed, tried again, and placed the screw perfectly into a labeled tray. No one clapped. No one made the moment larger than it needed to be. But Samuel saw the man's face change, just a little, as if time had given him one honest second back. In the weeks that followed, the shop filled with purposeful sound. Clocks being cleaned. Students asking questions. Coffee brewing in the back. Margaret's heels crossing the floor with another form to sign. Peter explaining budgets in plain language. Thomas identifying rare pieces with a wonder he tried to hide. Main Street changed too. The empty shoe repair next door became a small supply room for the program. The bookstore began staying open later because trainees came in after class. The diner added a breakfast special called the $1 plate, though Samuel made June change the name after 3 days because it embarrassed him. Harold's relatives challenged nothing after their attorney reviewed the trust in full. One of them, the woman in the cream coat, came quietly one afternoon and left an old mantel clock on the counter with a note that said, "He repaired this for my mother. I forgot. I am sorry." Samuel placed it on the intake shelf without judgment. Forgiveness, he was learning, did not always need a conversation. Sometimes it only needed a place to set down what pride had carried too long. On a clear Saturday, they held the first public open house. The clocks did not all agree on time yet, but most were running, each with its own voice. Bright ticks, wooden knocks, soft whirs, deep pendulum breaths. The trainees stood near their benches, explaining repairs to visitors with shy confidence. Chief rested beneath the framed dollar, watching the room like a gentle guardian. Samuel stood behind the counter where Harold had once stood and looked at the shop alive with people who had come not to laugh, but to listen. The $50 million had opened accounts, restored walls, funded wages, and protected the future. But the true inheritance was moving through smaller things: a steady hand, a labeled screw, a clock face cleaned by someone who had thought nobody would trust them with delicate work again. Near closing time, the grandfather clock struck 6, deep and warm, and every conversation paused. Samuel looked at Chief, then at the framed dollar above the counter. The room had once laughed at the smallest gift. Now that gift was teaching a town how to hear value before it made noise. By winter, second-hand works had become part of the rhythm of Main Street. The old Whitaker clock shop no longer looked like a forgotten storefront between a bookstore and an empty shoe repair place. Its windows were clean, its brass letters caught the morning sun, and inside, dozens of clocks ticked in uneven harmony, not perfectly together, but alive enough to make the room feel like it was breathing. Samuel Brooks opened the shop each morning before the diner turned on its grill, a 40-year-old white veteran with broad shoulders, a weathered face, dark brown hair cut short but no longer kept with military sharpness, and a few silver threads near his temples, wearing his faded field jacket over a blue work shirt, worn jeans, and scuffed brown boots. Chief entered first every day, the 6-year-old German shepherd with a black and tan coat, strong chest, alert ears, and calm intelligent eyes, walking past the framed $1 bill, past the grandfather clock, and into the workshop as if inspecting a place that had learned to keep its promise. The trust did not make Samuel flashy. It made him careful. $50 million sat behind accounts, oversight, payroll, building repairs, insurance, training grants, housing support, tool purchases, and quiet emergency funds for people who needed 1 month of rent more than they needed a lecture about responsibility. Margaret Ellis kept the legal structure clean. Peter Leland kept the finances honest. Thomas Keene preserved the rare clocks and patent models with the tenderness of a librarian handling old family letters. Samuel kept the benches full, the tools labeled, the coffee hot, and the rules simple. Show up, listen, write things down, respect the work, respect each other, and never call anything worthless before you understand why it stopped. The first graduating class finished on a snowy Friday evening. They did not wear caps and gowns. They stood behind the workbench with oil on their fingers, certificates in simple wooden frames, and repaired clocks lined up before them like witnesses. The former factory worker, whose hand had trembled the first morning, had restored a railway pocket watch so delicate that Thomas called it museum quality. The single mother had repaired 3 mantel clocks and had been hired by an antique restoration shop 2 towns over. One of the young men from the group home had become so patient with tiny gears that Samuel offered him a paid apprenticeship. A veteran who had arrived with his shoulders curled inward now taught new students how to disassemble a wall clock without losing the order of the screws. Chief lay beneath the framed dollar, head on his paws, eyes half closed, listening to voices that no longer carried shame. Harold's relatives came to the graduation quietly. Not all of them, but enough. The navy suit cousin stood near the back with his hands in his coat pockets, looking older than he had at the will reading. The woman in the cream coat brought another clock, this one wrapped carefully in a blanket, and asked if the students might repair it when they had time. She did not apologize again. She had already done that in the only way she knew how. Samuel accepted the clock and placed it on the intake shelf. Forgiveness had become easier once the shop grew louder than the memory of laughter. Near the end of the evening, Margaret asked Samuel to say a few words. He looked at the trainees, the neighbors, the old clocks, the framed $1 bill, and Chief watching him with calm, intelligent eyes. Samuel was not a man who trusted speeches, but he had learned that some rooms needed a blessing spoken plainly. Harold Whitaker left me $1 in front of people who thought they understood what it meant, he said. I thought I understood it too. I thought it was small. But small things can carry instructions. A screw can hold a movement together. A spring can bring time back to a room. $1 can open a door. A kind act can travel farther than the person who offered it ever gets to see. The room stayed quiet. Not empty quiet. Full quiet. The kind that meant the words had landed where they belong. After everyone left, Samuel remained alone in the shop with Chief while snow brushed softly against the front window. He turned off the lamps one by one, leaving only the small light above the framed dollar. The bill rested behind glass, ordinary and impossible, its blue gear mark still visible near the corner. Beneath it was Harold's sentence: "The smallest gift can open the largest door." Samuel stood before it for a long time. He thought of the conference room, polished shoes, hidden smirks, and the sting he had refused to show. He thought of Harold as a young man being helped by a veteran with enough mercy to give work instead of pity. He thought of all the people who had come through the shop since then, each carrying some private version of being laughed at, overlooked, or counted too late. Chief rose and leaned against his leg, warm, steady, faithful. In the showroom, the clocks continued their uneven chorus. Tick. Tick. Pause. Tick. None of them agreed completely, yet together they made something beautiful. Samuel smiled softly and placed one hand on Chief's head. He had been given a fortune, yes, but money had only been the mechanism. The miracle was smaller and greater: a $1 bill kept with honor, a dog who listened when others laughed, and a room where people learned that time was not finished with them yet.